By the final months of 1863, with Serizawa Kamo removed and Kondo Isami established as the Shinsengumi's uncontested leader, the organisation faced a problem that had nothing to do with external enemies,
and everything to do with its own rapid, disorderly growth.
A group of 20 men who had trained together for years at the Chiwegan shares an obvious, almost automatic cohesion, built from thousands of hours of shared practice, shared meals, shared hardship. The kind of bond that does not need to be enforced because it has already, through years of accumulated familiarity, simply formed on its own. A group of 100 men, most of whom arrived within the same few months, drawn from every corner of the country by reputation rather than by any personal connection to Kondo or Hijikata Toshizo, is a fundamentally different kind of organisation, and it requires a fundamentally different kind of glue to hold it together. Hijikata, who had already demonstrated, in the planning and execution of Serizawa's removal, both a capacity for administrative organisation and a willingness to act with lethal decisiveness when the organisation's survival required it, took primary responsibility for building that glue. What he built was a formal, written code of conduct, known as the Kyokchu Hatto, the regulations of the corps, and it is worth walking through its actual specific provisions in some detail, because a general description of its severity does not fully convey what it was actually like to live under it. The code's core prohibitions, as reconstructed from surviving accounts and later testimony from men who served under it, forbade a member from deviating from the way of the samurai, forbade leaving the organisation without formal permission, forbade raising funds privately for personal purposes, forbade taking on private legal or financial disputes without organisational authorisation, and forbade fighting for personal reasons rather than organisational ones. Each of these prohibitions, on its own, might seem like a fairly ordinary expectation for a disciplined military organisation to place on its members. What made the Kyokchu Hatto genuinely severe was the uniform penalty attached to nearly every one of these violations. Seppuku, ritual suicide, ordered and enforced by the organisation's own leadership, regardless of the specific circumstances or the severity of the individual infraction. It is worth explaining for anyone unfamiliar with the practice what seppuku actually involved in this period, because the term itself, translated simply as ritual suicide, does not fully convey the specific cultural weight it carried. Seppuku was, by the 19th century, already a practice with centuries of history behind it, understood throughout Japanese warrior culture as the correct and dignified way for a samurai to take personal responsibility for a serious failure, restoring, through his own controlled and deliberate death, the honour that his conduct had damaged, rather than being executed as a common criminal, a fate that carried a far deeper and more permanent social stigma, extending in many cases to the disgraced man's own family and descendants. The practice, as typically carried out in this period, involved a short blade, a careful, deliberate cut across the abdomen, and an assistant called a kaishakunin, a second, standing ready with a full-length sword to deliver a swift, merciful killing blow once the act of cutting had been performed and properly witnessed, sparing the dying man a prolonged and agonising death from the abdominal wound alone. Within the Shinsengumi, over the roughly 5 years the organisation existed, dozens of men died this way, not in combat against outside enemies, but by their own hand, at their own comrades' insistence, for violations of the Kyokchu Hatto that in almost any other military or police organisation of the period would have earned nothing more severe than a formal reprimand, or at worst, expulsion. This account has already described one such case, that of Sannan Keisuke, and will describe several more before this project reaches its conclusion. It is worth sitting here with the sheer scale of what this actually meant for the ordinary experience of Shinsengumi membership. A new recruit, joining the organisation in late 1863, or over the following years, was joining something in which nearly any serious mistake, any moment of genuine cowardice, any unauthorized personal decision, however minor it might have seemed outside the organization's own internal logic, carried the same potential consequence as the gravest imaginable offense. Why did Hijikata build the organization's internal discipline around a standard this severe? The surviving evidence does not allow for a definitive answer to this question, but the most consistent interpretation, offered by historians who have studied this period closely, points toward the specific fragility of what the Shinsengumi actually was in late 1863. A hastily assembled organization drawing recruits from every background and every region, in a city where a single act of internal betrayal or cowardice could, in the specific volatile political environment of Kyoto, potentially get the entire organization killed or discredited. Hijikata appears to have concluded that only the most severe, most consistently enforced standard of internal discipline could hold such an organization together and keep it functioning as something more coherent than a loosely affiliated collection of armed provincial swordsmen. Whether this judgment was correct, whether a somewhat less severe standard might have achieved similar cohesion at a lower human cost, is a question this account does not believe it can answer with any real confidence, and it will not pretend otherwise. What can be said with considerably more confidence is that the Kyokchu Hatto, whatever its human cost, appears to have worked in the narrow specific sense that it did produce, out of an unlikely and rapidly expanding collection of provincial swordsmen from every corner of the country, one of the most disciplined, most cohesive, and most feared organizations operating in Kyoto's streets by the middle of 1864. New recruits, arriving throughout the autumn and winter of 1863, understood immediately, from the moment of their induction, exactly what standard of conduct the organization expected of them, and exactly what awaited any failure to meet it. This clarity, however brutal its underlying logic, appears to have produced a level of battlefield reliability and internal cohesion that a looser organization, drawing from the same varied recruitment pool, might well have struggled to achieve. Alongside the Hijikata and Kondo, also formalized the organization's internal command structure during this same period, establishing a clear hierarchy. Kondo as Kyokcho, commander, Hijikata as Fukucho, vice commander, with primary responsibility for internal discipline and day-to-day organizational administration, and a tier of officers below them known as Fukuchojokin, assistant vice commanders, each typically responsible for leading a specific squad of roughly 10 men, a structure recognizably military in its basic logic, even though most of the men now filling these roles had no formal military training beyond their own individual swordsmanship. Okita Soji, by this point already recognized as one of the organization's most formidable swordsmen despite his young age, received one of these squad leadership positions, as did several other men whose names will recur throughout the remainder of this account. Sannan Kesuke, appointed to the senior position of Socho, a kind of chief of staff role sitting alongside Kondo and Hijikata at the organization's very top, and Nagakura Shinpachi, whose own squad leadership and considerable swordsmanship placed him firmly among the organization's most respected senior figures. This organizational structure, backed by the severe enforcement mechanism of the Kyokchu Hatto, transformed the Shinsengumi over the final months of 1863 and into the first half of 1864, from a locally sponsored auxiliary police force into something closer to a genuine paramilitary organisation, with a clear chain of command, a rapidly growing membership, and an internal discipline that, whatever its human cost, gave it a level of operational cohesion that few comparable groups in Kyoto's chaotic political landscape could match. It was this newly disciplined, newly structured organisation that would, within a matter of months, be called upon to prove itself in circumstances considerably more demanding than routine street patrol. a plot, uncovered through careful and often brutal intelligence work, to set fire to the imperial capital itself, and to use the resulting chaos to seize control of the emperor's person. That story, and the single night of violence that made the Shinsengumi's name known throughout the entire country, begins with a man named Hidetaka Shuntaro. The events that would make the Shinsengumi famous throughout Japan began not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet arrest, carried out in early June of 1864, against a man whose ordinary daily occupation gave almost no hint of the network he was secretly a part of. Hidetaka Shuntaro ran a charcoal and firewood shop in Kyoto, an unremarkable small business of exactly the kind that filled the city's commercial streets, providing fuel to households and businesses across the old capital. Behind this ordinary storefront, however, Hidetaka was a committed sympathizer of the Sono-Joy radical cause, and his shop had become, over the preceding months, a genuine logistical hub for Choshu-aligned activists who remained in Kyoto even after the August 18th coup had formally expelled Choshu's military presence from the city. The Shinsengumi's own intelligence-gathering apparatus, developed over the preceding year through the kind of patient, unglamorous surveillance work that this account has not yet had occasion to describe in detail, had gradually identified Hidetaka as a person of serious interest, someone whose shop appeared to be storing weapons and serving as a point of contact for radical activists coordinating activity within the city. On the 5th day of the 6th month, by the old calendar, in 1864, Shinsengumi operatives raided Hidetaka's shop and took him into custody, along with a quantity of weapons and other materials that confirmed the organization's suspicions about his role within the broader radical network still operating in Kyoto, despite the previous year's political setback. What happened next is one of the more genuinely difficult episodes in this entire account to describe honestly, because it involves methods that a modern audience will, quite reasonably, find disturbing, and that this account does not intend to minimize or explain away simply because they were carried out by the organization whose story it has spent so much time following. Hidetaka was interrogated under torture, a practice that, however uncomfortable it is to acknowledge, was not unusual for serious criminal and political investigations in this period, carried out according to methods that had a long, established history within Japanese law enforcement practice, methods this account will not describe in graphic detail, but that were, by any reasonable modern standard, brutal. Under this interrogation, Hidetaka eventually provided information that, whether entirely accurate or partially exaggerated under duress, described a plot of genuinely alarming scope. A plan, coordinated among Choshu-aligned radicals still active in Kyoto, to set fire to the city during a period of strong wind, using the resulting chaos and confusion to seize the emperor's person, remove him from the capital, and carry him toward territory more directly sympathetic to the radical cause, while simultaneously assassinating key figures associated with the shogunate and the court's more moderate faction, including, according to some versions of the confession, Matsudaira Katamori himself. This account has already noted in its earlier discussion of the historiographical debate surrounding these events that considerable uncertainty exists about how much of this plot was genuinely as advanced and as coordinated as Hidetaka's interrogation suggested, and how much may have reflected exaggeration extracted under duress, or even, according to some more sceptical historians, a degree of after-the-fact justification constructed by the Shinsengumi and Aizu to explain a violent raid that produced considerable bloodshed among people who may, in the strictest sense, have simply been meeting rather than actively finalising an imminent attack. What is not seriously disputed, however, is that the Shinsengumi's leadership, upon receiving this information, believed it represented a genuine and urgent threat and acted accordingly, with a sense of real urgency that shaped everything that happened over the following 48 hours. Kondo and Hijikata, upon learning what Furutaka's interrogation had revealed, understood that time was now a critical factor. If a genuine plot to burn the capital and seize the emperor was actually underway, any delay in locating and neutralizing the remaining conspirators risked allowing the plan to proceed. The problem, however, was that Furutaka's confession, whatever its other details, had not provided a single confirmed location where the remaining conspirators were currently gathered. What it had provided was a general sense that some kind of meeting or meetings were likely occurring somewhere within the city, among Choshu-aligned activists and their allies from other domains, coordinating whatever final steps their plan required. Locating that meeting among the dozens of inns, lodging houses and safe houses scattered across a city the size of Kyoto would require exactly the kind of systematic, exhausting search that the Shinsengumi, drawing on the organizational structure and disciplined manpower Hijikata had spent the preceding year building, was now, for the first time in its short history, genuinely equipped to carry out. On the afternoon of the 5th day of the 6th month, the Shinsengumi prepared for what would become the single most consequential operation in its entire history. Kondo divided the available force, numbering somewhere between 30 and 40 men, according to the most reliable surviving accounts, into separate search parties, reported to Matsudaira Katamori, and requested Aizu reinforcements to support the operation. And then, without waiting for those reinforcements to actually arrive, began a systematic search of Kyoto's inns and lodging houses, working through the crowded, humid summer evening, checking location after location, finding at each stop nothing. The night was advancing. The search had, by most accounts, already covered a significant portion of the city's likely locations, without success, and Aizu's promised reinforcements had still not appeared, delayed, according to several accounts, by internal disagreement within Aizu's own leadership about the wisdom of committing forces to an operation whose actual target remained, as of that evening, still entirely unconfirmed. It was into this atmosphere of mounting urgency, exhaustion and uncertainty, sometime around 10 o'clock in the evening, that Kondo's own search party, working its way through the streets near the Sanjo Bridge in the heart of Kyoto's old commercial district, arrived at a modest inn called the Ikedaya, and noticed something that struck Kondo as worth a closer look. Signs of unusual activity, unusual enough at this late hour to justify one more inquiry before the night's exhausting search continued elsewhere. He could not have known, stepping through that doorway, that he was about to walk into the single most consequential 2 hours of his entire life, and of the organization he had spent the preceding year building. The Ikedaya was, by every surviving description, an entirely ordinary inn, the kind of modest lodging house that filled the streets near the Sanjo Bridge, offering rooms to travellers and to the kind of quiet business meetings that innkeepers throughout the city hosted without particular curiosity about their guests' actual affairs. On this particular night, its upper floor held a gathering of radical activists. Most accounts suggest somewhere between 12 and 20 men, drawn from Choshu, from Tosa, from Higo, and from several other domains sympathetic to the Sonojoi cause, meeting to discuss exactly the kind of coordinated response to recent setbacks that Furutaka's interrogation had described. Though the precise agenda of this specific meeting, whether it was finalising an imminent attack or simply discussing strategy in more general terms, remains, as this account has already noted, a matter of genuine historical debate. Kondo's own search party at the moment of the raid was small, considerably smaller than popular later retellings have sometimes suggested. The most reliable accounts, drawn from Kondo's own subsequent letters and from Nagakura Shinpachi's own later testimony, indicate that Kondo entered the inn with only 3 other men directly alongside him: Okita Soji, Nagakura himself, and Todo Heisuke, a younger swordsman whose story will recur later in this account, with several additional men positioned outside to secure the building's exits. Kondo confronted the inn's proprietor at the entrance, learned that a gathering was indeed underway upstairs, and made the decision, one that later commentary has both praised as decisive courage and questioned as reckless impatience, to proceed immediately rather than waiting for Hijikata's larger search party, still working through other locations elsewhere in the city, or for Aizu's still delayed reinforcements. Climbing to the inn's upper floor, Kondo and his 3 companions found the gathered activists, weapons close at hand, in the middle of whatever discussion had brought them together that evening. Kondo announced, according to his own later account, a formal declaration of the kind procedurally required before this sort of law enforcement action. That this was an official inspection, and that anyone who offered violent resistance would be met with lethal force. What followed was close, chaotic fighting in cramped, low-ceilinged rooms and narrow stairwells. A fundamentally different kind of combat than the controlled dojo environment these men's swordsmanship training had actually prepared them for. Fought by lamplight, in rooms too small for the kind of wide, sweeping technique that more formal styles of swordsmanship favoured, against opponents who, whatever their numerical advantage, were fighting for their lives, with the desperate intensity that cornered men in a life-or-death confrontation typically bring to a fight. It is during this early phase of the fighting that the persistent, though not entirely verifiable, account of Okita's collapse is usually placed. A sudden, severe episode, possibly a coughing fit severe enough to bring up blood, that forced him from active combat, and that many historians now believe represented the first visible sign of the tuberculosis that would, within 4 years, end his life. This account cannot claim full certainty about the precise details of this episode, since the surviving primary sources vary somewhat in how they describe it, and some later popular retellings have likely embellished the moment for dramatic effect. What can be said with more confidence is that Okita, by every account, fought with extraordinary skill in the fight's opening minutes, and that something, whether illness or simple physical exhaustion after the preceding hours of exhausting search, removed him from the most intense phase of the combat that followed. Todo Heisuke, fighting alongside Kondo and Nagakura, was struck across the forehead during the fighting, a wound that, while not immediately fatal, bled heavily enough into his eyes to force his own withdrawal from active combat, leaving Kondo and Nagakura for a genuinely dangerous stretch of the fight, facing a room full of armed and desperate opponents, essentially alone. Nagakura, in his own later memoirs, one of the single most valuable surviving accounts of this entire night, described this period of the fighting in terms that convey genuine, unglamorized danger. A fight in which the numerical disadvantage he and Kondo faced was severe enough that survival, for a period of some minutes, was genuinely uncertain, dependent on skill, on narrow physical spaces that limited how many opponents could engage them simultaneously, and, in no small part, on simple fortune. Relief arrived, according to the most reliable accounts, in the form of Inoue Genzaburo, leading a reinforcing detachment that had been searching a separate location and redirected toward the ikedaya, once sounds of fighting made the location of the actual confrontation clear. And, somewhat later, Hijikata himself, arriving with a larger contingent that had spent the earlier hours of the evening searching an entirely different part of the city. With these reinforcements, the numerical balance of the fight shifted decisively. Several of the activists were killed in the fighting itself. Others attempted to flee and were cut down or captured in the streets surrounding the inn, as Aizu and Kuwana domain troops, finally arriving well after the fighting's most dangerous phase had already concluded, helped seal off the surrounding area and conduct a citywide sweep for anyone who had managed to escape the inn itself. This account has already discussed, in its earlier survey of the source material, the genuine uncertainty that surrounds the precise casualty figures from this night. Uncertainty this account does not want to paper over, simply because a cleaner narrative would be more satisfying to tell. Traditional accounts, drawing on later commemorative records compiled by sympathizers of the fallen activists, describe casualty figures reaching into the double digits among the radical loyalists. Alongside a smaller number of deaths and injuries among the Shinsengumi's own men, Okita and Nagakura both suffering relatively minor wounds, Todo his more serious head injury, and several other Shinsengumi members killed either in the inn itself or in the broader citywide sweep that continued into the following morning. More recent historical scholarship, drawing on contemporary rather than later commemorative sources, has suggested that the actual number of people present in the Ikedaya's upper room at the moment of the raid may have been considerably smaller than popular tradition later claimed, perhaps as few as 10 or a dozen, rather than the 20 or more that later dramatised retellings often describe. And that the higher casualty figures commonly cited may conflate deaths that occurred during the infighting itself with deaths and captures that occurred during the broader citywide manhunt that continued for days afterwards. This account will not pretend to resolve this scholarly disagreement with any false confidence. What can be stated with reasonable certainty is this: several genuinely significant figures within the radical loyalist movement died that night or in its immediate aftermath, including Miyabeta Izo, a respected leader within the Higo domain's loyalist faction, and Yoshida Toshimaro, a prominent Choshu activist, losses serious enough that the radical movement experienced them, correctly, as a genuine and significant setback. One additional detail deserves mention, both because it has become a persistent feature of later popular retellings, and because the actual historical evidence surrounding it is more uncertain than those retellings typically acknowledge. The dramatic image, familiar from later films and television dramas, of a fleeing activist tumbling down the inn staircase after being struck by Kondo's blade. Contemporary historians studying the surviving primary sources have generally concluded that this specific dramatic detail, while vivid and cinematically compelling, appears to be a later literary embellishment rather than an event documented in the actual contemporary record, one of several instances where popular fictional treatment has, over the following century and a half, layered additional dramatic colour onto a night whose actual events, however genuinely dangerous and consequential, were somewhat less theatrically choreographed than later storytelling has sometimes made them appear. By the time dawn arrived, the fighting was long over, and the Shinsengumi, exhausted after a night that had begun with a routine, frustrating search, and ended with the single most consequential combat action of the organization's entire existence, waited until full daylight before returning to their headquarters in Mibu. Moving slowly through streets already filling with curious onlookers who had heard, through the fast-moving channels of urban rumour, that something significant had happened near the Sanjo bridge overnight. What none of them could have fully appreciated yet, exhausted and still processing what had actually happened, was that this single night's fighting was about to transform their organisation, almost overnight, from a locally known Kyoto police auxiliary into a name spoken with genuine fear and genuine fascination throughout the entire country. News of what had happened at the Ikedaya reached Choshu within days, travelling along the same networks of couriers and sympathisers that had, until so recently, connected the domain's political operatives working inside Kyoto to its leadership back in the western provinces. And the reaction it produced there was not simply grief for the men who had died, but something closer to a collective sense that the domain's honour itself had been struck a blow that could not go unanswered. To understand why this single night's fighting produced consequences as large as it eventually did, it helps to remember the position Choshu already occupied, in the summer of 1864, in the broader political struggle this account has been describing. The domain had been formally expelled from Kyoto only the previous year, in the August 18th coup. Stripped of the court influence its radical faction had spent years carefully building. The Ikedaya raid, striking down several of the domain's most capable remaining operatives inside the very city from which it had already been excluded, read, to many within Choshu's leadership, as confirmation that reconciliation through patient political manoeuvring was no longer a realistic path, and that only a direct show of force could restore the domain's position. Over the following weeks, Choshu mobilized a genuinely significant military force, drawing on troops from the domain itself and from allied sympathizers in neighboring domains, and began advancing toward Kyoto with the explicit, publicly stated purpose of presenting a petition to the emperor demanding the restoration of Choshu's position at court. A petition backed, unmistakably, by the presence of an armed force encamped at the very gates of the city. This was an enormously dangerous escalation, and it split opinion, even within Choshu's own leadership, between those who believed a direct military demonstration was the only remaining option, and those who worried, correctly as events would prove, that marching an armed force toward the emperor's own palace, whatever the stated intention behind it, risked being interpreted, by the shogunate and its allies, as nothing less than an act of open rebellion against the throne itself. By the middle of the 7th month of 1864, Choshu forces had positioned themselves at several points around Kyoto's southern and western approaches, including positions near Fushimi and near the Tenryuji temple grounds, close enough to the city that a genuine military confrontation had become, by this point, essentially unavoidable. The Shinsengumi, still absorbing the aftermath of the Ikedaya raid only weeks earlier, along with Aizu's regular forces and troops from several other domains loyal to the shogunate's cause, prepared to defend the city and, crucially, to defend the palace itself, where the emperor resided, against what the shogunate's side now regarded, regardless of Choshu's own stated justifications, as an armed threat to the throne's own physical safety. The fighting itself broke out on the 19th day of the 7th month, in the area surrounding several of the palace's outer gates, and it is remembered, ever since, as Kinmon no Hen, the Kinmon incident, sometimes also called Hamaguri Gomon no Hen, after the specific gate, the Hamaguri Gate, where some of the fighting's most intense combat occurred. The scale of this engagement dwarfed anything the Shinsengumi had previously experienced. This was not a targeted raid against a small group of activists gathered in a single inn. It was a genuine military battle, fought with organised troop formations, artillery, and firearms alongside traditional swordsmanship, between Choshu's advancing forces and a coalition of shogunate-aligned domains defending the palace's approaches. The Shinsengumi's own role in the fighting, while smaller in scale than the contributions of the larger domain armies involved, was significant enough that the organisation's growing reputation for combat effectiveness, established so dramatically at the ikedaya only weeks earlier, was further reinforced. Fighting alongside Aizu's regular troops, Shinsengumi units engaged Choshu forces in the streets and alleys surrounding the palace's southern approaches, bringing to this larger, more chaotic battlefield the same close-quarters swordsmanship that had proven so effective in the cramped rooms of the ikedaya. The battle itself was relatively brief but genuinely intense, and it ended in a clear and decisive defeat for Choshu's forces, who were driven back from the palace approaches and, within days, forced into a broader retreat from the entire Kyoto region, pursued by shogunate-aligned forces, determined to ensure the domain's military presence near the capital was fully eliminated. The human cost of this fighting extended, however, well beyond the soldiers directly engaged in combat, in a way that the more contained violence of the ikedaya raid had not. Fires broke out across significant portions of Kyoto during and immediately after the fighting, whether started deliberately by retreating Choshu forces, as some contemporary accounts suggest, or ignited accidentally amid the general chaos of urban combat, involving artillery and firearms within a city built almost entirely of wood and paper. And these fires spread, over the following 2 days, through a truly staggering portion of the old capital. This catastrophic fire came to be known, in the grim, understated language Kyoto residents developed to describe it, as Dondon Yake, a name whose exact origin is debated, but that captured, in its very sound, something of the relentless, spreading, seemingly unstoppable quality of the destruction, as block after block of the old city's traditional wooden architecture, shops, temples, and ordinary residential homes alike, caught fire and burned through the summer nights that followed the battle's conclusion. Estimates of the fire's total destruction vary across different contemporary sources, but the most commonly cited figures suggest that somewhere between a quarter and a third of the entire city was destroyed or seriously damaged. Tens of thousands of individual buildings reduced to ash across a catastrophe that dwarfed by any measure the military engagement that had actually ignited it. This is worth dwelling on because it is easy, telling a story centered on the Shinsengumi's own particular military engagements, to lose sight of the broader human cost that the political conflict this account has been describing was beginning by the summer of 1864 to inflict on Kyoto's ordinary population. People who had no direct stake in the argument between shogunate loyalists and imperial restorationists, but who lost their homes, their shops, and in many documented cases, their lives, to a fire that grew directly out of a political and military confrontation they had played no part in causing. For the Shinsengumi specifically, the political consequences of the Kinmon incident, distinct from the human tragedy of the fire itself, were overwhelmingly positive, in the narrow, cold sense that political consequences are sometimes measured. The organisation had now participated directly in defending the imperial palace itself against what was, regardless of Choshu's own stated justifications, widely regarded as an act of armed rebellion against the throne. This service, combined with the already growing fame the Ikedaya raid had generated only weeks earlier, elevated the Shinsengumi's standing dramatically, both within Aizu's own administration and within the broader shogunate hierarchy in Edo, whose officials were, by this point, receiving detailed reports of an organisation that had proven itself, twice within a single summer, capable of decisive and effective action at moments of genuine crisis. Choshu itself, meanwhile, emerged from the Kinmon incident in a position of genuine and severe political isolation. The domain had, in the eyes of the shogunate and of the imperial court itself, now moved from being merely a politically radical faction to being an outright military threat to the emperor's own safety. A designation that would, within weeks, produce a formal shogunate order for a punitive military expedition against Choshu itself, the first of two such expeditions this account will describe in its later sections, and a designation that hardened, rather than softened, the deep resentment many within Choshu's leadership already felt toward the shogunate and its allies. Resentment that would, within a few short years, feed directly into the alliance between Choshu and its former rival Satsuma that would ultimately bring the entire shogunate down. For now, though, in the immediate aftermath of the summer of 1864, none of that future was yet visible. What was visible was simply this: an organisation that had begun the year as a locally known Kyoto Police Auxiliary, its name recognised mainly within the narrow world of shogunate administration and Aizu sponsorship, had, within the span of a few short weeks, become one of the most talked about forces in the entire country, celebrated by the shogunate's supporters as heroes who had twice, in rapid succession, defended the established order against radical violence, and regarded, with equal intensity, by the shogunate's opponents as a hated symbol of everything standing between them and the restoration they believed Japan urgently required. Kondo himself, within this new atmosphere of fame and formal recognition, found himself, for the first time in his life, being received by officials whose social standing would have been entirely unreachable to a rural dojo instructor only 18 months earlier. A rapid elevation this account will follow closely over its remaining sections, because it shaped, in ways both fortunate and ultimately tragic, nearly everything that happened to him over the following 4 years. In the months following the Kinmon incident, the Shinsengumi underwent a period of growth so rapid that it forced a fundamental reorganization of how the group actually functioned, transforming it from a still modest force of perhaps 100 men into an organization numbering, by some contemporary estimates, well over 200 by the end of 1864, and continuing to grow further over the following 2 years. This growth required a more sophisticated internal structure than the organization had previously needed. And it was during this period that the Shinsengumi formalized the squad system that would define its operations for the remainder of its existence. 10 numbered squads, each led by a kumicho, squad captain, drawn from the organization's most trusted and capable senior swordsmen, with each squad responsible for its own training, its own patrol assignments, and its own internal discipline, all ultimately answerable to Hijikata's overall authority as vice commander. Okita Soji commanded the first squad, a position of particular prestige reflecting both his extraordinary swordsmanship and his close personal history with Kondo, stretching back to his childhood at the Shiekung. Nagakura Shinpachi led the second squad. Saito Hajime, a swordsman whose own story this account will follow closely in its later parts, commanded the third. Matsubara Chuji led the fourth. Takeda Kanryusai, a man whose scholarly background in military strategy made him a valuable, if ultimately controversial, addition to the organization's leadership, commanded the fifth. Inoue Genzaburo, whose reinforcements had proven so crucial at the ikedaya, led the sixth. Tani Sanjuro commanded the seventh. Todo Heisuke, still recovering from the head wound he had suffered at the ikedaya, eventually resumed command of the eighth. Okazawa Eisuke commanded the ninth, and Harada Sanosuke, a skilled spearman whose story this account will return to in its later sections, led the 10th. This structure gave the organisation a genuine capacity for coordinated, large-scale operations that its earlier, more informal arrangement could not have supported. And it reflected more broadly Hijikata's continuing project of transforming what had begun as a loose collection of provincial swordsmen into something functioning with the discipline and organisational clarity of a genuine military force. The organisation's daily operations by this period had settled into a fairly consistent rhythm. Squads rotated through patrol duties covering different districts of Kyoto, particularly the entertainment and lodging house districts, where radical sympathisers were most likely to gather. Maintained a network of informants and paid intelligence sources scattered throughout the city's merchant and innkeeping communities, and conducted regular training, still centred on swordsmanship, but increasingly incorporating instruction in the use of firearms, as the organisation's leadership, watching the broader trajectory of military technology, even in these still early years of the conflict, began to recognise that swordsmanship alone might not remain sufficient indefinitely. The organisation's growing prestige also began attracting a different calibre of recruit than its earliest days in Mibu had drawn. Men with genuine scholarly credentials and broader political ambitions of their own, rather than simply provincial swordsmen seeking a path to status through martial skill alone. Among the most consequential of these new arrivals was a man who joined the organisation in the autumn of 1864, in the immediate aftermath of the Kinmon incident's political aftershocks. Ito Kashitaro, a scholar and swordsman from Edo, whose own story will occupy a considerable portion of this account's third part, and whose eventual split from the organisation would produce one of its most consequential internal crises. Ito arrived with genuine academic credentials in both swordsmanship and classical scholarship, and Kondo, eager to add intellectual and political sophistication to an organisation that had, until this point, drawn its strength almost entirely from martial skill and organisational discipline, rather than from any particular scholarly reputation, welcomed him with real enthusiasm, eventually granting him a position of genuine seniority within the organisation's leadership structure. This account will have considerably more to say about Ito and the tensions his arrival eventually produced. But it is worth noting here, at the moment of his initial recruitment, But his arrival represented something genuinely new for the organisation. Its first serious attempt to cultivate not just martial reputation, but broader political and intellectual legitimacy as well. This growing prestige also brought Kondo himself into direct contact with a level of shogunate officialdom that would have been entirely unreachable to him only 2 years earlier. He was received during this period by senior shogunate officials visiting Kyoto, consulted on matters of Kyoto security policy, and treated increasingly not as the leader of a locally sponsored auxiliary force, but as a figure of genuine standing within the broader shogunate hierarchy. A transformation that Kondo, by every surviving account, experienced with genuine pride, tempered by the same plain, unpretentious manner that had characterized him since his earliest years as an obscure rural dojo instructor. Letters from this period, written to family and former associates back near Edo, describe this new status in terms that convey both real satisfaction and the certain characteristic modesty. Kondo, noting his rising responsibilities alongside small, ordinary details of his daily life, requests for news from home, comments on the changing seasons, the small domestic continuities that persisted, quietly, underneath even the most dramatic transformations his public life was now undergoing. It was also during this period of rapid growth that the organisation's financial arrangements, always a practical necessity for a force that had expanded so far beyond its original modest funding, became considerably more sophisticated. Aizu's sponsorship continued to provide a core budget, but a force numbering 200 or more men, requiring swords, armour, provisions and lodging, along with the informant networks and intelligence operations the organisation increasingly relied upon, required resources beyond what Aizu's stipend alone could comfortably provide. Kondo and other senior officers cultivated relationships with Kyoto and Osaka's wealthiest merchant houses during this period, borrowing funds against the organisation's growing prestige and its close ties to Aizu and the shogunate. Surviving merchant account records preserved by houses including the Konoike family of Osaka, one of the most established merchant dynasties in the entire Kansai region, document loans extended to the Shinsengumi during this period, a detail that reveals something easily overlooked amid the sword fights and political intrigue that dominate this account's narrative. That the Shinsengumi, whatever else it was also of practical necessity an organisation that had to manage money, negotiate credit terms, and maintain working relationships with the merchant class. A class the old samurai order had traditionally regarded with considerable disdain, but that the changing world taking shape around these men was, in increasingly undeniable ways, coming to depend upon. By the close of 1864, the Shinsengumi stood at what was, in retrospect, close to the peak of its institutional strength and its public reputation. A well-organised, well-funded, genuinely feared force numbering well over 200 men, its name recognised throughout Kyoto and increasingly throughout the entire country, its leadership received with genuine respect by shogunate officials, who would never have granted a rural dojo instructor and a farmer's youngest son so much as a passing acknowledgement only 3 years earlier. What this account must turn to next, though, is the underside of this rapid growth. The internal strains that inevitably accompany any organisation expanding this quickly. Strains that would, over the following 2 years, produce some of the most difficult and most morally troubling episodes in the Shinsengumi's entire history, beginning with the quiet, tragic story of a founding member whose growing doubts about the path the organisation had chosen would cost him his life. Before this account turns to the political crises that would eventually consume the Shinsengumi from without, it needs to tell the story of a loss that came from within, in the early months of 1865. A loss that reveals something important about the actual human cost of the discipline this organisation had built. Sannan Keisuke was not, strictly speaking, one of the original Shiekan corps, though his connection to the organisation ran nearly as deep. He came from a swordsmanship background in the Hokushin Ittoryu, a considerably more prestigious tradition than Kondo's own Tennendi Shindyu, and he had joined the group during its earliest days in Kyoto, quickly earning a position of genuine seniority through both his swordsmanship and his evident intellectual sophistication, a quality that distinguished him somewhat from many of his fellow officers. By the time of his death, Sannan held the position of Socho, a role that sat in the organization's formal hierarchy alongside Kondo and Hijikata at its very top, a kind of chief of staff whose responsibilities touched on nearly every aspect of the organization's internal administration. He was, by nearly every surviving account, a thoughtful, well-educated man, and several later sources describe him as someone whose bearing carried a certain gentleness that distinguished him from the harder-edged temperaments of many of his fellow senior officers. The precise reasons behind what happened to him in the early spring of 1865 remain, even now, a subject of genuine historical uncertainty, and this account intends to walk through the competing explanations honestly, rather than presenting any single account with more confidence than the surviving evidence actually supports. The traditional explanation, repeated across many popular retellings of this story, holds that Sannan had grown increasingly uneasy over the 2 years since the organization's founding, with the direction it had taken, its escalating severity, the internal killings this account has already described in the case of Serizawa Camel, and, perhaps, doubts about the underlying legitimacy of the shogunate's cause itself, doubts that were, by 1865, becoming increasingly difficult for any thoughtful, well-informed person in Japan to entirely avoid, given how visibly the shogunate's political position was deteriorating. A second explanation, given somewhat more weight by certain historians who have studied the surviving contemporary sources closely, points towards Sannan's health. Several accounts from this period describe him as suffering from a persistent illness, possibly a respiratory condition, not unlike the tuberculosis that would later claim Okita Soji, and suggest that his departure may have been motivated, at least in part, by a wish to seek treatment, or simply to spend whatever time remained to him away from the organization's relentless demand, rather than by any specific political or ideological disagreement. A third explanation, offered by a smaller number of historians, suggests a more personal dimension. Some accounts describe a romantic attachment had formed and speculate that his departure may have been connected in ways the surviving sources do not allow us to fully reconstruct, to this relationship rather than to any grander political or philosophical crisis. This account will not pretend to resolve this uncertainty with false confidence. What can be said with reasonable certainty is this. In the early spring of 1865, Sannan left Kyoto without the organization's formal permission, travelling east along roughly the same road these men had all originally walked from Edo 2 years earlier, apparently intending to leave the Shinsengumi behind entirely. Under the Kyokuchu Hatto, the strict code Hijikata had built specifically to hold this rapidly expanding, increasingly diverse organization together, desertion carried a single, unambiguous penalty, regardless of the deserter's rank. His years of service, or the specific personal reasons that may have motivated his departure, Sannan's seniority, his genuine contributions to the organization's administration, his personal friendships with nearly every other senior officer, none of this created any exception within the logic Hijikata had built, and had already, in the case of Serizawa, demonstrated a willingness to enforce without hesitation. Okita Soji was dispatched to locate him, and found him in the town of Otsu, not far from Kyoto, along the very road Sannan had presumably hoped would carry him safely back toward Edo, and away from the organization he had apparently decided he could no longer remain part of. Okita brought him back to Kyoto. Sannan was ordered to commit seppuku, and did so, according to the most consistently repeated accounts, with a composed, deliberate dignity that several witnesses specifically remarked upon. A calm acceptance of the consequence his own organization's rules demanded of him, whatever private grief or private conviction had actually driven him to attempt his departure in the first place. Several sources, though this detail carries some of the same uncertainty this account has already acknowledged regarding the broader circumstances of his death, describe Okita as serving as Sannan's Kai Shakunin, his second,
the man whose sword would deliver the final merciful blow once Sannan had completed the act of cutting himself.
If this detail is accurate, and it is repeated across enough independent sources that many historians treat it as reasonably reliable, it represents one of the more quietly devastating moments in this entire account. A young man, still only in his early 20s, ending the life of an older colleague he had trained beside for years, whom he had personally tracked down and escorted back to face exactly this fate, because the organisation's own rules, the same rules he had presumably helped enforce against other men on other occasions, permitted no exception, not even for a friend, not even for a man whose only crime may have been illness, or heartbreak, or an entirely understandable exhaustion with a life that demanded more of him than he had left to give. This account does not know, and will not pretend to know, what Okita felt in that moment, standing over a man he had known for years, sword raised, waiting only for Sannan's own final motion before ending his suffering. The surviving sources do not record his private thoughts, and any attempt to invent them would cross from honest historical narration into speculation this account has committed, from its opening section, to avoid. What can be said, with confidence the evidence genuinely supports, is this. The Shinsengumi's own rules, the same rules Hijikata had built, specifically to hold a fragile, rapidly expanding organisation together, did not bend for friendship, for seniority, for genuine contribution, or, quite possibly, for illness. Every member who remained in the organisation's ranks after Sannan's death understood, with a clarity words alone could never have achieved, exactly what the price of leaving would be, should any of them ever find themselves, for whatever reason, no longer able to continue. Sannan's death also marks, in a way this account wants to note explicitly, a kind of turning point in the organisation's own internal culture. The killing of Serizawa had been, in its own way, more straightforward to understand, even if not necessarily easier to morally justify. A genuinely dangerous, genuinely destabilising figure, removed for the organisation's collective survival. Sannan's death was different, a case where the organisation's own severe logic consumed one of its own most capable and most respected administrators. A man whose actual threat to the organisation's survival, whatever his private reasons for leaving, was considerably less obvious than Serizawa's had been. It is worth carrying this distinction forward into the remainder of this account, because the Shinsengumi's story, over its final 3 years, contains several more episodes that follow this same difficult pattern. An organisation whose discipline, built with genuine and understandable purpose in its earliest, most fragile months, would go on enforcing itself with undiminished severity, even as the actual threats it had originally been designed to address evolved into something considerably more complicated, and considerably harder to justify with the same simple clarity that had, perhaps, been available to Kondo and Hijikata in the case of Serizawa 2 years earlier, in a farmhouse in Mibu, on a rainy September night. This account has spent a great deal of time, across its first 18 sections, describing violence. Assassinations, internal purges, pitched battles fought in cramped inn-rooms and burning city streets. It is worth pausing, before returning to the political crises that would eventually consume the organisation, to describe a different, quieter dimension of these men's lives, one that the more dramatic episodes of this story tend to crowd out of popular memory. Kyoto in this period contained, alongside its temples, its palace, and its increasingly violent political struggles, a formally licensed entertainment district called Shimabara, and, somewhat less formally but no less significantly, the tea house and entertainment culture surrounding the Gion, district near the Osaka Shrine. both of which occupied a genuinely important and culturally sanctioned place within the social life of the city, rather than existing at its disreputable margins in the way a modern audience might initially assume. It is worth explaining briefly what these districts actually were, because the common English translation, red light district, carries connotations that do not fully capture their actual social function in 19th century Japan. Shimabara operated under a formal licensing system established generations earlier by the shogunate itself, governing everything from the training and conduct of its entertainers to the specific etiquette expected of patrons. An elaborate, highly structured world with its own internal hierarchy, its own seasonal calendar of festivals and observances, and its own genuinely sophisticated artistic traditions in music, dance, and conversation. The most accomplished entertainers within this system, particularly those holding the rank of taiyu, were expected to master not just musical and conversational skill, but calligraphy, classical poetry, and a range of other genuinely demanding cultural accomplishments. And their company was valued by patrons across every level of society, at least as much for genuine artistic and intellectual engagement as for anything more straightforwardly transactional. Kondo Isami, Hijikata Toshizo, and other senior Shinsengumi officers were, by multiple surviving accounts, regular visitors to these districts, a pattern of behaviour entirely unremarkable for men of their rising status in this period. Officers with genuine income and genuine standing throughout Japanese history had visited such districts as a matter of ordinary social practice, and the Shinsengumi's senior officers, whatever their organisation's severe internal discipline regarding matters like desertion and personal conduct on duty, were not, in this particular dimension of their lives, unusual among their contemporaries. Surviving letters and later testimony suggest that some of these relationships carried genuine emotional weight, rather than existing purely as transactional arrangements. Kondo himself, despite his family back near Edo, appears to have formed at least one relationship with an entertainer in Kyoto's licensed quarters that several later accounts describe in terms suggesting real personal attachment, though the specific details, as with so much of this account's more intimate material, rest on sources whose full reliability this account cannot claim complete certainty about. Hijikata, in particular, appears in a considerable number of later accounts and local traditions, connecting him to relationships formed within Kyoto's entertainment districts. Accounts that, taken together, suggest a man whose public reputation for severe, almost cold discipline coexisted with a private capacity for genuine romantic attachment that his contemporaries, and later chroniclers, found notable enough to specifically remark upon and preserve. This account has already discussed, in its earlier examination of Hijikata's own haiku poetry, the layered quality of his personality, the coexistence of severe organisational discipline with a genuinely attentive, even tender private sensibility. His documented visits to Kyoto's entertainment districts and the relationships that appear to have grown from them fit this same broader pattern. A man capable of ordering an old comrade's death without visible hesitation, who was also, in the private hours his duties allowed him, capable of the kind of genuine emotional connection that his public reputation, focused so heavily on his role as the organisation's feared enforcer, does not fully account for. It is worth remembering, holding these details alongside the violence that dominates so much of this account, that the men of the Shinsengumi were, whatever else history has made of them, young men living through an extraordinarily dangerous and uncertain period of their own lives, most of them in their 20s, a handful still in their teens, and that they sought out, in whatever hours their duties allowed, the same music, conversation, and companionship that young men in any era, facing genuine danger and genuine uncertainty about how much longer they might actually live, tend to reach for. The entertainment districts also served a more practical, less romantic function within the organisation's actual intelligence operations, a detail this account has not yet had occasion to mention.
Tea houses and entertainment establishments throughout Kyoto functioned in this period as genuinely important nodes of information exchange, patronized by figures across the entire political spectrum, shogunate loyalists and imperial restorationists alike. And the Shinsengumi's own officers appear to have used their visits to these districts not merely for personal enjoyment, but as opportunities to gather intelligence, cultivate informants, and monitor conversations among Kyoto's broader political and merchant class, whose loyalties and sympathies remained, throughout this entire period, a matter of genuine ongoing concern to an organisation whose survival depended on staying ahead of exactly the kind of quiet, political conspiracy that had produced the Ildanyu raid in the first place. This dual function, entertainment district visits, serving simultaneously as genuine personal recreation and as practical intelligence gathering, captures something worth holding on to about how thoroughly these men's entire lives, even their most private and most seemingly unrelated hours, had become entangled with the organisation's larger institutional purpose. There was, for a senior Shinsengumi officer by 1865, no fully private life left untouched by the organisation's demands. No evening of music and conversation that did not also carry, somewhere beneath its surface, the possibility of useful information overheard, a potential informant cultivated, a rival faction's movements quietly noted and reported back to headquarters the following morning. Whether this constant entanglement between private life and institutional duty felt, to the men actually living it, like an oppressive weight, or simply the unremarkable texture of their ordinary existence, the surviving sources do not fully allow us to say. What they do allow us to say, with reasonable confidence, is that even in these quieter, more intimate corners of the Shinsengumi's history, the organisation's demands were never entirely absent, a thread running underneath even the music and lamplight of Kyoto's entertainment districts, connecting back, always, to the same relentless institutional purpose that had brought these men to Kyoto in the first place, and that would, over the following 3 years, ask considerably more of them than any evening of music and conversation could ever repay. This account has already mentioned, in its earlier description of the ikedaya fighting, the persistent story of Okita Soji suffering some kind of sudden physical collapse during the battle's opening minutes. An episode many historians now believe represented the first visible sign of the illness that would, within 4 years, end his life. It is worth returning to this moment now with somewhat more care, because it marks the quiet beginning of a decline that would run underneath nearly everything else this account has left to tell. The illness in question was kekkaku, tuberculosis, a disease that, in the medicine of the 1860s, anywhere in the world, offered no real cure and only the crudest tools for managing its progression. It was understood, in general terms, as a wasting disease of the lungs, transmitted between people in close, prolonged contact, producing a characteristic pattern of persistent coughing, gradually worsening over months and years, fevers that came and went without clear pattern, a slow, uneven loss of strength and appetite, and, in its more advanced stages, the coughing of blood that gave the disease one of its old English names, consumption, for the way it appeared to consume its victims slowly from within. Japan in this period had its own long medical tradition for understanding and attempting to treat this disease, drawing on centuries of accumulated herbal and dietary practice. But this tradition, whatever genuine comfort or modest symptomatic relief it may have provided, possessed no more capacity to actually cure the underlying disease than European medicine of the same period did. A diagnosis of kekkaku in 1864 was not, in any meaningful sense, a death sentence with a predictable timeline, but it was, for nearly everyone who received it, eventually fatal. The only genuine uncertainty being how many months or years the disease would take to run its course. For Okita, in the immediate aftermath of the ikedaya raid, whatever this early episode actually was, whether a genuine early symptom of tuberculosis or simply severe physical exhaustion after an exceptionally demanding night, life continued largely as before. He remained one of the organization's most active and most respected squad leaders, commanding the first squad, with the same extraordinary swordsmanship that had defined his reputation since his earliest years, training at the Shieikan. And there is no strong evidence in the surviving record that his illness, if this early episode genuinely was its first appearance, significantly limited his activities over the following 2 years. This is worth emphasizing because tuberculosis in its earlier stages often permits exactly this kind of extended period of apparently normal function, punctuated by episodes of illness that can, especially in a young and otherwise physically robust person, seem more like isolated bad spells than the early stages of a serious and ultimately fatal disease. Okita, by every account of his conduct over the following 2 years, continued to train, continued to fight, continued to lead his squad with the same skill and the same characteristic good humour that had defined him since childhood, even as the disease that would eventually kill him was, quietly and gradually, establishing itself within him. There is something worth sitting with in this particular detail that connects to a theme this account has already touched on in its discussion of Monono Aware, the Japanese aesthetic sensibility around beauty and impermanence. Okita, by wide agreement among his contemporaries, was the single most naturally gifted swordsman within an organisation that contained a great many genuinely excellent swordsmen. A young man whose skills seemed to require no visible effort and whose personal warmth and easy laughter made him, by every surviving account, one of the most personally beloved figures within the entire organisation. That this same young man was already carrying, from perhaps as early as the summer of 1864, the disease that would end his life at an age most of his contemporaries would consider barely into full adulthood, gives his remaining years within this account's narrative a quality that this account does not want to overstate through excessive sentiment, but also does not want to pass over without acknowledgement. He continued, "Across the years, this account still has left to cover, doing exactly what he had always done, fighting with extraordinary skill, leading his squad with genuine care for the men under his command, while a disease neither he nor anyone else fully understood the trajectory of was steadily, invisibly, doing its own quiet work." This account will return to Okita's illness at the point in this larger chronicle where it finally became impossible to ignore, in the final chaotic months of the Shinsengumi's existence, when a young man who had once been the organization's most feared and most admired swordsman found himself confined to a sickbed in Edo. Unable to participate in the war that would consume nearly everyone else this account has introduced. For now, though, in the still triumphant years of 1864 and 1865, Okita remained exactly what he had always been, a young man of extraordinary skill, well liked by nearly everyone who served alongside him, carrying within him, unknown to himself and to everyone around him, the first quiet beginnings of the illness that would eventually claim him. Let us pause here at the close of this account's second part and take stock of where the Shinsengumi actually stood in the middle years of the 1860s, before this larger chronicle moves on to the political crises that would eventually unravel everything this organisation had built. By the end of 1865, the Shinsengumi was, by nearly every external measure, a genuine success. It numbered well over 200 men, organised into 10 disciplined squads under experienced captains. It commanded real fear and real respect throughout Kyoto, a reputation built on the twin foundations of the Chaitanya raid and the Kinmon incident, two engagements that had transformed an obscure provincial police auxiliary into one of the most recognised names in the entire country. It enjoyed the continued sponsorship of Aizu, the growing respect of the broader shogunate hierarchy, and a level of institutional stability that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the small, uncertain group of leftover ronin who had settled into Mibu's farmhouses 2.5 years earlier. Kondo Isami himself had travelled a distance, in these same 2.5 years, that few men of his original background could ever have realistically hoped to travel. From an obscure rural dojo instructor, teaching farmers' sons in a hard-packed dirt training hall on the edge of Edo, to a figure received with genuine respect by senior shogunate officials, his name recognized throughout Kyoto and increasingly throughout the country. His organization treated as one of the shogunate's most valuable and most reliable instruments in its ongoing struggle to hold Kyoto. And with it, the broader political order the shogunate had governed for 2.5 centuries, together against the mounting pressures of imperial restoration. But this account has also tried, throughout its second part, to hold this external success alongside its genuine internal costs. Costs this account does not believe an honest telling of this story can responsibly leave out. The organization's severe internal discipline, embodied in the Kyokuchu hut that Hijikata Toshizo had built specifically to hold a rapidly expanding, increasingly diverse membership together, had already claimed the life of Sannan Keisuke, a founding officer whose actual threat to the organization's survival remained, even by this account's own honest assessment, genuinely uncertain. The organization's growing fame had come at a real cost to the city it operated within, a cost visible in the tens of thousands of buildings destroyed in the fires that followed the Kinmon incident, a catastrophe that, whatever its complicated causation, grew directly out of the same political conflict the Shinsengumi had positioned itself so prominently within. And beneath the surface of this organization's continued growth and continued success, a young man named Okita Soji, still only in his early 20s, was carrying, invisibly and unknowingly, the first quiet beginnings of an illness that would, within a handful of years, end his life, long before any of the political questions this larger conflict was still working to resolve had themselves been settled. This account has tried, throughout its second part, to resist the temptation to tell this story as a simple narrative of rising triumph, because the actual historical record does not support such a simple narrative. And because this account believes, as it stated in its very opening section, that the Shinsengumi's story is worth telling honestly in its full complexity, rather than smoothed into either uncomplicated heroism or uncomplicated villainy. What comes next, in this account's third part, is the period during which the political ground beneath the Shinsengumi's feet began, slowly and then with increasing speed, to shift in ways that even the organization's growing strength and growing discipline could not ultimately withstand. The arrival of Ito Kashitaro and the internal schism his own political sympathies would eventually produce, the shogunate's mounting political difficulties as the broader conflict between shogunal authority and imperial restoration continued to intensify, and the beginning of the specific sequence of events that would, within less than 3 years from where this account's second part now leaves the Shinsengumi, bring the entire political order these men had given their lives to defend crashing down around them. None of this was yet visible, in the closing months of 1865, to the men still training in Mibu's practice yards, still patrolling Kyoto streets in their light blue jackets, still gathering, in whatever quiet hours their duties allowed, in the tea houses and entertainment districts this account has just finished describing. They knew only what any of us can ever know, living through our own particular moment, the present circumstances of their own lives, whatever fame or security or quiet private happiness those circumstances currently provided, and no clear sight at all of how much or how little time remained before everything they had built together would begin inexorably to come apart.